Honored to welcome you to a conversation on race, sexual expression, and civil rights law, a conversation about the Danielle Watts controversy. I wanted to start off by saying that the law school is just really thrilled to sponsor this event. What we want to do more of is really reach out to the community and have events that allow us to bring USC's special interdisciplinary lens to understand social conflict. One of the things that tends to happen is we rely a lot on media accounts to understand contemporary social problems, and those understandings can be supplemented by scholarship produced at the university, but we want to open our doors so we can actually really build on this conversation. We want our alumni and our community to see us as a place to openly explore issues and to provide a context for a really full and informed debate. So my primary task is to introduce our moderator, Michelle Gordon. But I wanted to begin by thanking Dean Rasmussen for providing the funding for this event, to also thank all of the faculty members on the faculty committee who coordinated our resources and made this possible, Scott Altman, Nomi Stolzenberg, Ron Garrett, as well as to thank the various departments at USC for allowing their faculty members to participate, and those include the sociology department, the American Studies department, the English department, and the history department. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Michelle Gordon. She's an assistant professor of English and gender studies, and she works on Black women's cultural productions, cultural studies in the 19th and 20th century, and multicultural writing. She's currently working on a manuscript entitled Bringing Down Babylon, and it's about the Black arts movement and the Chicago Renaissance.
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me okay? Wonderful. I'd like to join Camille in extending my welcome to this conversation and my thanks to Gould School of Law for sponsoring this event. I'll give a brief background to the events that we are here to discuss, and then I will introduce our panelists and tell you all how we will proceed for the rest of the conversation. On September 11th, 2014, Danielle Watts and Brian James Lucas were approached by a Los Angeles police officer who was responding to a 911 call reporting that an interracial couple were indecently exposing themselves and possibly having intercourse in a car parked on a street in North Hollywood. Believing that she did not need to identify herself to the officer under the circumstances, Watts refused to do so and left the scene. She was apprehended by a female officer summoned to assist in the situation and placed in handcuffs. Once Lucas provided her ID to the police, the couple was released. What ensued hardly needs recap, but suffice it to say, a media frenzy ignited in which the debates about Watts' right to refuse to identify herself and about claims of racial profiling continue to rage. The debate has touched a number of nerves among various individuals and sectors of the public and the academy. Because this case is ongoing, we are required to limit our discussion somewhat in terms of the particulars of the case and its surrounding events. Today's event, then, is in part a response to the call that Danielle herself issued in her September 27th op-ed piece in the Los Angeles Times, which argues that, quote, the conversations our country has been having about the role of race in minor incidents such as mine and life and death ones must continue. So, to get the ball rolling, I will introduce our panelists, and then, as I said, give you a little bit of ideas on how to proceed. First, we will hear from Professor Camille Gear Rich, who is Professor of Law here at USC, Professor of History, Law, and Gender Studies here at USC, and she will situate the discourses and responses to interracial intimacy within a historical context. Following that, we will hear from Danielle Watts herself. Danielle is an alumna of USC, graduated in 2007, and she works in both theater and film. She made her film debut in 2012 as the houseslave Coco in Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, and has appeared in the TV series Weeds. Following the presentations by these three ladies, Professor Shana, Redmond, and myself will comment very briefly on this before we turn to the audience to open for questions and answers and discussion. Professor Shana Redmond is Associate Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, and she currently is the Ella Baker Visiting Professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So without further ado, I will turn things back over to Camille. Thank you.
I feel like I was just here. Okay, so Thank you, Michelle. I feel uniquely privileged to be the first person to speak on this panel because this conflict really has primarily been framed as a legal conflict, that there are important legal questions that we need to explore. But I feel that thus far, maybe we've only sort of scratched the surface in terms of what the really pressing legal questions are. And it's sort of a really unique opportunity because I have Ms. Watts here in front of me, and so I felt like I was in a dialogue with you all along as I was sort of thinking about the case, but to actually get a chance to see your reactions to some of the things that I was thinking about is truly a unique opportunity. So as we take a look at the case, we know what the two primary legal questions are, at least in terms of contemporary conversation at this point. And one of my questions is, are we asking the right questions, right? So the two questions we're asking at present are, was Ms. Watts required to provide identification to Sergeant Parker? And was Ms. Watts involved in sexual conduct in the car with Brian Lucas? And my question is this the best we can do in shaping public debate? Have we exhausted all the questions that are available to be asked? Now, I grew deeply concerned as I listened to more and more media coverage that just focused in on these two questions. And I asked myself, what was being left out? Now, I have to admit my perspective is somewhat special. I'm coming to this primarily as a professor of law. I'm also a professor of sociology, and I've long been interested in the ways in which the law shapes our understandings of race and gender, and also relies on our understandings of race and gender, that it's an interactive process, and we can learn a lot about critically thinking through both sides of this exchange. But I also come to this conflict as a woman of color. And I do agree with Justice Sotomayor that one's personal background, one's race, can actually help one in identifying facts or legal arguments that actually might not seem apparent to people who don't come from the same background. The project is to then take those arguments and translate them into a more objective form so that they are accessible to others. And so that, in part, is what my project here is intended to do. So what I want to do is give you an opportunity to actually look at the tape and think about whether or not the two questions we've been asking actually exhaust all of the possible options. Before I show you the tape, what I want to do is cheat a tiny little bit and introduce you to some of the questions that I was considering as I viewed the film. So the sociological questions, right, are people in the post-racial era sanctioned for identifying racism? Do you see any evidence in the film that people are actually sanctioned when they name issues of race? Another question is contemporary civil rights protest gendered? Right? This case involves a Terry stop, which has been a classic issue in civil rights litigation. But those Terry stops have typically involved men. Are the issues different when men are stopped in Terry stop situations and women are stopped? These two sociological questions shift our perspective and allow us to see new and important legal questions. Instead of asking, was Ms. Watts required to provide her ID? Actually, the question is, was reasonable articulable suspicion dissipated over the course of her interaction with the officer? If we think about whether or not there's a sanctioning process going on when someone names issues of race, there's a possibility that the officer becomes distracted from what the primary inquiry should be and shifts to another domain. The second question is, do seemingly neutral police investigation procedures subsidize private racism? So as you look at their interaction, think about whether or not Ms. Watts is actually trying to name neutral social practices that actually have discriminatory effects and what the response is to that articulation. And then the final question is, what are the boundaries of sexual privacy in contemporary society? That is a car a private space? When does it become a public space? How does that affect all of us? I don't know if any of you watch sitcoms on television. There was an episode of The Mindy Project not 2 nights ago, right? The primary joke in the case was that they were having sex in the car on the highway, right? No pathologization of their conduct, right? That's not to say that that's necessarily what happened in this case, but I'm saying when Cosmopolitan magazine tells women that 80% of people in the United States fantasize about having sex in cars, but the Watts controversy is framed in a particular way, it's time to take a look at what cultural messages we're sending and whether they're different, whether incidents are interpreted differently depending on the races of the people involved. I've gotten about 2 minutes into my presentation and gotten an indication that I have 5 minutes left, so it's going to be a lot shorter. Okay, so I'll show you the video. It's actually an audio tape, but there's a picture provided with the audio tape. And so I'm going to play it the way the audio tape was displayed on the TMZ website.
Who's the owner of the car?
That's me. Your registration?
No, don't worry about it. How about her ID?
Well, I have her passport.
Okay.
Daddy, can you
Who is she to you?
for a second? Hold on. Excuse me. What's the issue?
Somebody called the police saying that there was lewd acts in the car.
There's no lewd acts happening.
Doesn't matter, I have to ID you.
We're not doing anything.
Somebody
I'm on
called.
the phone with my dad. This is my boyfriend.
Okay, I want to see your ID. Somebody called, which means gives me the right to be here. So it gives me the right to identify you
do you know how
by
many times
law.
I've been called? The cops have been called just for being black.
That is
not, because we're black and he's white. I'm just being really honest.
I don't. Who brought up a race card?
I'm bringing it up because
I said nothing about you being black. And I have every right to ask your ID.
And I have every right to say no. And if you'd like
no, you do not have every right to say no.
You can take me down to the court office and I can make a scene about it.
No.
And you know what? I have a publicist and I work as an actor at this studio. Okay?
I'm mildly interested. You have a publicist, but I'm going to get your ID.
So I am going to say no. And if you'd like my ID, you can say that I am resisting arrest and you can take me down.
There's no resisting. You're just interfering.
And what I'm saying is I have not done anything wrong. I'm on the phone with my father. My stepmom is dying.
Do you know what probable cause is? You know what probable cause is?
Yes, and I have none. What is the probable cause?
I have probable cause.
I'm sitting here talking on the phone to my father.
That's
so if
mildly
you'd like to demand my ID.
Can you have her ID, please?
No, you may not. You may not have my ID. And if you would like to demand
L30, send me a female officer, please.
Please do.
I'm going to get your ID one way or the other.
That's fine. You can do whatever you like.
Yes, I am.
Daddy?
Thank you for bringing up the race card. I never hear that.
Daddy, I can't believe it. Like, all the things that are happening with the cops right now, I can't make out with my boyfriend in front of my fucking studio without getting the cops called on.
We were like in our garage and the cops came up just because like
I don't have to give him my
our
ID
place and someone said
because it's my right to sit on the fucking street corner and take out with my boyfriend. That's my right.
Keep yelling. It really helps. It really helps.
Hey, my dad would like to talk with you.
No.
My father would like to talk with you. He's on your speakerphone, so here you go. Daddy, you're on speakerphone. He doesn't want to hear. He doesn't care. He doesn't care. It doesn't matter. You can call the cops on somebody and all of a sudden you're a criminal. I'm just going to walk away.
Great.
I'd already be gone, just so you know. I'd be gone.
You don't need me? Can I get my license?
No, I got your license. I said I'd already be gone. I would be gone. Yeah. Yeah. I'd be gone.
Oh, God.
Okay, so that video is upsetting every time I watch it. And I think you understand why if you understand the questions, right, that are floating through my mind as I watch the interaction. So my comments are going to be abbreviated because, as I mentioned, I've run out of time. But right, what we're looking at is a classic Terry stop, which is a key part of civil rights protests. A lot of protests has surrounded around the fact that Black and Latino men are disproportionately stopped in these Terry stops, and the Terry stops then lead to criminal investigations. And one of the key triggers, right, in the deeper and more extensive criminal investigation is the production of ID. Okay? So officers will ask for ID supposedly to dissipate suspicion, but actually what they're supposed to be doing in a Terry stop is looking for evidence of the crime that they were called for. And it's not clear at all that ID functions very well in determining whether or not illegal activity was occurring. So in this circumstance, right, the decision not to provide ID might have been a wise one. Now, I'm going to say to you more generally, okay, it's actually somewhat dangerous, right, to resist an officer in that way and say, I don't want to provide ID. And if you don't have any reason to be particularly concerned about providing ID, that's a decision that you need to make in that circumstance. But as you can see from this particular incident, when you resist, right, there's a high likelihood that police will sanction you, so there's some danger associated with that conduct. But the question in this case was, did he have any information to suggest, right, that the illicit activity, that the lewd, lascivious conduct had not occurred or was not occurring? And I submit to you, right, as you listen to the tape, as she says, here, talk to my father. I'm here outside the CBS studios. This is why I'm here. This is my boyfriend. The officer goes on for another 20 minutes, right, talking with her boyfriend in a way that suggests he actually doesn't think any criminal activity has occurred. His attention has shifted to, right, the politics of submission. He wants the ID. She's raised this issue of racism, this conflict has developed, and he wants submission on that particular issue. Some of you may have noticed that the officer actually gets the law wrong, that he's talking about probable cause. He certainly doesn't have probable cause, which is what he would need is necessary for an arrest. What he has in that moment is reasonable articulable suspicion, and that suspicion can abate pretty quickly when you're presented with people who appear not to be involved in criminal activity. I love you to death, Shana. I'm going to ignore you, okay? I'm sorry. Okay. Terry stops have been the subject of really major civil rights cases. There was a recent case in New York involving a class of Black and Latino men who sued the New York City Police Department for police practices that resulted in them being disproportionately stopped in these Terry stops. You could imagine a similar sort of case developing involving interracial couples. If interracial couples are systematically targeted for these calls of lewd and lascivious behavior or problematic behavior, and subject to more of these Terry stops, the legal claim starts to actually have more credibility. If you think about disproportionate enforcement, if you think about race actually affecting the politics of who gets stopped. I hope you're following this because I'm going extremely fast. But if you think about it in that particular way, the civil rights claim in this case does not seem so strange after all. But it's incredibly trivialized from the start of the case. The other thing I wanted to mention is sexual intimacy issues have long been a part of the civil rights movement. No one has said a single word about that in this case. Loving v. Virginia was a case about a Black woman marrying a white man. Sexual intimacy, right? A key case that ended miscegenation statutes in the United States. A more contemporary case, right? Lawrence v. Texas is entirely about sexual intimacy, and it's not in the context of marriage. It's about sexual autonomy and people who have marginalized sexualities claiming public space, claiming recognition. So again, the sexuality issues, the intimacy issues in this case being civil rights issues, it's actually a recognized proposition in other contexts. The question is why was this case not framed in this particular way? And are we going to see any changes in the future as we think about it through this particular lens? Let's see. The last thing I'll mention is the race card. So we have to cover this before I shut it down. Okay, so is civil rights protest gendered? I was going to actually discuss with you, maybe in the question and answer period, some of the material implications of Black-white interracial couples being targeted disproportionately, because there are actually material implications that flow from that problem. But I wanted to talk about the race card in the post-racial era and talk about some of the sociological understandings that we have that actually sort of explain Officer Parker's reaction to Ms. Watts' claim. Okay? We know that whites believe avoiding discussions of race is the best way to avoid appearing racist. The best way. You do not raise the race issue. You do not play the race card. They want to avoid discussions of race. We know that people who identify racism are not liked. People tend to avoid them. They are troublemakers. We know that people who identify racism are branded as failures, which means that the most successful people in society, right, are very afraid of naming racism when they see it happening. There are just too many social costs. So who does that leave us in terms of our civil rights soldiers? It's people who maybe are not afraid of taking risks. Starts to sound a little familiar, right? People who aren't afraid of losing their standing. We also know that people who are non-racist get extremely angry when you identify neutral social practices as having discriminatory effects. In their view, that's one of the worst things that you can do. You're not only raising race, but you're eliminating a neutral practice that they've relied upon in the past as being fair and naming it as being a problem. And finally, we know that people who excuse racism or ignore racism actually have the problem of growing more racist over time. So the more racism that you ignore, your uncle who says an inappropriate thing, your brother-in-law, over time you become immune to some of these comments and you actually develop problems of your own. Okay? So some of you, now you understand why I'm looking at Sergeant Parker and I'm really concerned about what I'm seeing, right? Because all of these things are happening that we know from the sociological literature that are going to make him primed, that are going to prime him to be angry. Right? So in my view, the case becomes one about post-racial rage. It's Officer Parker's post-racial rage about having race named in this particular context, and that rage actually distracts him from what he's supposed to be doing. Instead, he goes on this witch hunt, right, for an ID, And he seems like an officer who maybe in another context might act more reasonably. But we know from the sociological literature that certain things happened in that encounter that deeply disturbed him. And he goes on and on about the race card long after, right, the conversation has shifted. The last thing I'll say is about the fame card. I know I'm violating the rules terribly. I'm sorry. Right, but the interesting thing about the fame card in this particular case is Sergeant Parker says he's this heroic figure who was about to be ruined, and in fact there were going to be race riots in Los Angeles because of what had happened with Mrs. Watts presenting this issue on her Facebook page and riling people up. And he says, I had to make a decision. We were facing another racially tumultuous incident in LA. I said, this has to stop right away, and I drove to my station and I grabbed the recording and I called TMZ. It stopped the next day. And so my question for you is, in terms of interesting and important civil rights questions, no one's raised the issue of why police officers are routinely recording Terry stops without the consent or knowledge of the people involved in the Terry stops. They're allowed to under California wiretapping law. There's no problems in terms of its legality, but as a civil rights issue, you might raise some questions about that, but no one has asked a single question. One also might ask why he turned to TMZ. When I think of the newspaper of record, when I think about objective reporting, my first thought is not of TMZ. When I think about quelling racial unrest, my first thought is not TMZ. Okay? So you can look at the coverage, cops after car sex. She pulls the race card, the fame card. Is that helping the situation? We got the pictures and it looks like sex. And then my favorite, they give you the news story in the beginning, and then they ask who's the bad guy, cop or actress? Is that what we want to rely on to frame public debate about this issue? Is that what we've come to? We don't have enough time, but I wanted to talk about female aesthetics. Ms. Watts has raised the issue that when she changed her personal appearance, police interest in her relationship increased, her treatment changed in society. We could talk about that as well during the question and answer period. But the final point about the fame card is just, Ms. Watts has been sort of villainized for saying, I'll call my publicist, I'll get the media to pay attention to this issue. And what I want to suggest to you is Officer Parker knows the media has an interest too, right? He knew that his actions were being filmed the entire time. So he was aware of the publicity and framed his interactions in that debate, fully knowing that he might be able to use that audio tape later on. And then he made a strategic decision to turn that tape over to TMZ. So although Ms. Watts has been villainized for saying, I might call my publicist, I suggest to you that TMZ was Officer Parker's publicist in this regard. Okay, thank you.
So while I do have a courtesy appointment here at the law school, that comes from many, many years of reading 19th century interracial inheritance cases. So what I know about contemporary law is rather limited. Although it came to my attention yesterday as I was preparing for this talk that California's indecent exposure statute dates back to 1872 and hasn't really substantively changed since then. So I don't know a whole lot about contemporary law, but I do know a great deal about 1872. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this case from my standpoint as a historian of the 19th century of race and sex, and marriage and the family in the 19th century. And in that regard, I'm less interested in the behavior of the officer, although I think that's incredibly important, and I'm glad that Professor Rich focused on that, because I think far too much attention has been focused on Ms. Watts' behavior, alleged behavior, and not as much on the officer's behavior and on the media attention subsequent to the case, and on the attention to the media attention and the social media response. So just as a background for this, this timeline is here to show you that some of America's oldest laws, and the bigger question that I'm trying to get to here is, how do we as a society, what factors, what social and cultural factors in this society may have led to the decision by the person who called the police to make that call? How do we more broadly decide what is so obscene, so offensive to the eyeballs that we need to invoke police power to protect ourselves and others from it? All right. So, and I say that also, I thought I toyed with showing a clip from Greece, which I believe every American has seen. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? It's the scene in the drive-in movie theater. And what are people doing in the drive-in movie theater in Greece? Not watching the movie. Not watching the movie. And indeed, there's a whole history book titled From Front Porch to Back Seat, a history of courtship and dating in America, which is alluding to not the playing of Scrabble in the back seat. So in any case, clearly, as a historian of interracial marriage, I'm interested in the fact, and I think it is relevant for and of course I cannot read the mind of the person who made the call, but it is relevant that interracial marriage prohibitions are some of the longest lived laws in American history. They go back to the colonial period, and they go forward until after the birth of our first biracial president, which means that had he not been born in Hawaii, he might have been born illegitimate, okay? And these laws, generally speaking, worked to contain the social and financial effects of white men sleeping with women of color, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to keep white women, who were legally defined as the only people who could legally bear white children and future citizens, to keep them from birthing anything other than white children. So interracial relationships were policed differently, even though the laws were facially neutral, depending on the races and sexes of the parties. And it's worth pointing out, this is a map showing the distribution of these laws in 1865. They're quite widespread. And lest you think that, this is it goes down from there in terms of gradually the laws are repealed after emancipation, that's not the case. Rather than declining, anti-miscegenation laws grew following the Civil War. Indeed, the term miscegenation originates from the Civil War. It originates from a backlash against the movement of the war from being arguably about keeping the Union together to being a war that was very clearly linked to emancipation and the abolition of slavery. So miscegenation itself emerges at a particular time for historical reasons specific to that period. California, yes, California, I don't think it was on the previous slide. Yes, there, it's repeated. California was one of the first Western states to ban interracial marriage. A lot of my students don't know that. And it kept expanding its prohibition, adding Mongolians and Malays. And of course, all of these laws, for the most part, the common denominator was white supremacy. It was never about prohibiting Mongolians or Chinese from marrying people of African descent. It was always about preserving white supremacy. So I want to, and one last thing about this. In 1967, at the sort of tail end of what we think of as the 20th century civil rights movement, when Loving versus Virginia happened, 4 out of 5 Americans disapproved of interracial marriage. So this is a public opinion phenomenon as well. So I want to take a minute and talk about the image that was on the promotional poster, which was published in England in 1824 to promote a play which was popularizing the genre of a comedy of humors. The title here is Every Man in His Humor, which I take in sort of contemporary parlance to mean whatever floats your boat. Or if that's your kink, okay. All right. 19th century viewers of this cartoon would have recognized the image in the back of the wall, on the wall, as a woman known as the Hottentot Venus. And there are many of my students here. They've seen this and many, many, many other cartoons that were produced in the early 19th century of this woman. Her name was Sarah Bartman, as she was known in English. She had been a slave in Dutch-colonized South Africa until 1810, when her owners brought her, she was 20 at the time, to London. They exhibited her in a skin-tight, flesh-colored costume and charged admission to see her. She was the subject of a popular vaudeville show. Cartoonists represented her as having enormous buttocks, and she was also represented as smoking, which was considered extremely unfeminine. All right, so calling her a Venus, Venus, of course, refers to the goddess of beauty, was supposed to be ironic. Viewers were intended to take her as symbolic of ugliness. Now, freak shows were popular entertainment in the West at the time, but Bartman achieved transnational fame such that her image was shorthand in this initial slide, because respected scientists of the period used her body to make the claim that black people had excessive sexual appetites and that they were different from whites as a race or even as a species, that blacks and whites represented separate species. After she died at the age of 26 in 1816, her body was dissected by Georges Cuvier, who was a very influential scientist, considered the father of modern biology. And he published a report about the dissection that slipped between science and porn, and by focusing on contrasting her genitals with those of implicitly normal white European women. Now, this was one of at least 7 such dissections of black women in the 19th century, whereas now, in the 21st century, sort of racialist sex humor might focus on black male penis size. Biologists and race theorists in the 18th and 19th centuries focused on the appearance and wild or savage sexual comportment of black women, often rooting their claims for race difference in sexual traits. So going back to this cartoon, this is not to say that sex between black women and white men was unthinkable. Indeed, when Bartman was being displayed in London, Thomas Jefferson's 4th child, 7th pregnancy by his slave Sally Hemings, was 3 years old. Sally Hemings herself was the product of 2 generations of sexual relationships between black women and white men. Provided that the progeny of such relationships were enslaved, which they usually were after a mid-17th century law providing that children were to follow the status of their mothers, and provided that the men kept their business, whatever floats your boat, to themselves, and didn't expect others to treat their black female sexual partners with respect due to elite white women, nobody cared, or at least nobody who mattered cared. And it's worth emphasizing that for most of American history, black women did not have the social or legal protections available to other women. They were expected to do as much field work as a man. Their reproductive capacities were the engines for the production of and the reproduction of the enslaved workforce. And indeed, rape under most state codes was defined as a crime against a white woman's body. All right? So in 1824, when this image emerged, there was nothing new about interracial sexual relationships. But what was new, building on the science produced by those who examined Sarah Bartman, was the idea that black and white represented different species whose mixing was unnatural, which is conveyed by this baby, half white, half black baby, and that the white people in particular who engaged in such mixing were somehow sexually perverse. So far from breaking down racial barriers, because there's this whole way of thinking that, oh, race mixing leads to the breaking down of racial barriers. This image is part of a pre-Civil War genre of images of interracial couplings that is about producing the idea of race, and not just producing the idea of race, but producing the idea of whiteness as normal and blackness, and particularly black femininity, as grotesque, as indicated here by the image of Bartman on the wall and by the black doll in the child's hands. This people would have recognized as necessarily obscene in the mid-19th century. The ankles showing, the PDA in the corners. We might now just say, okay, it's a group of people dancing, black women, white men dancing. But in the 19th century, this was considered obscene. Laws prohibiting interracial sex declared in effect that interracial sex was different than same-race illicit sex, and that punishing miscegenation, interracial sex, more severely than fornication was not a violation of equal protection, because the punishments were symmetrical for both white and black parties. So this decision, Pace versus Alabama, which is the only U.S. Supreme Court decision to address miscegenation law before Loving versus Virginia, with the exception of one that I'm not going to talk about, was good law until the 1960s, all right? And it shows the ways in which sexual questions underpinned Plessy versus Ferguson. One of the cases involved in preceding Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the civil rights cases, which was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1883, I couldn't resist bringing up, okay, 2 more minutes, involved a black woman traveling with her nephew who was kept from the ladies' car, even though she had paid for the first-class accommodations that involved, because she was traveling with her nephew who looked white. And the conductor in his defense said, well, I thought that because she was a black woman traveling with a light-skinned man, she must be a prostitute. And I don't let prostitutes travel in the ladies' car. This was one of, so race, the conductor responded in his defense, had nothing to do with my decision. This decision was about sex. And it sounds so familiar that I couldn't resist bringing the case up. I want to end with a question about lewd conduct. Again, how do we decide what is so disgusting? This is an image also meant to, it's alluding to the stench of black womanhood. How do we decide what is so disgusting, what is so lewd, that it requires our protection from the police, right? Or it requires that the police be called upon to protect us. Famously, the U.S. Supreme Court said in 1964, you know, I know it when I see it. Well, okay, so how do we know it? How do we know what's obscene? And how do we decide what rises to the level of calling the police, saying not just cut it out, but, you know, but let's have a backlash against someone who might raise questions about the police being called. And I just, for comparison's sake, I can't resist, even though I was advised to, reminding you all of an incident from 2011 on a college campus where there were a number of pictures. And I reviewed the Google News coverage and noticed that while there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles about this incident, not one, only one actually, Perez Hilton's blog, raised the question of lewd conduct per se. The reason that the onlookers called the police was because they were worried that they might fall off the roof, okay? Which, and there are fire codes involved. All right, I'm finishing up to go back to TMZ, and it's at this moment that really public opinion turned, as measured by the internet, against Watts and Lucas. These images, I would venture, are not nearly as incriminating as the previous ones. This is the last slide. And yet, they were accompanied by a narrative. You see, a narrative horizontally bongoing her boobs back and forth, a narrative that was so cinematic in its dialogue that I've had friends say to me, but wasn't there video, right? The video wasn't there, so they produced it in people's imaginations. In any case, asking us to think about what is lewd conduct and how do social norms factor into that. A final point, when I Google lewd conduct, which I'm ashamed to admit that I did, I know that's not how we start our legal research, but you get a law firm's website that is targeting clientele, gay male clientele, who are likely to have been entrapped in police stings. Saying, you know, if you want to just make the charges go away, that's one thing, but we're here to fight those charges. So with regard to sex, what kind of sex? Ooh, 2 men kissing, that's gross, let me call the police. What kinds of sex do we deem offensive, and how do we decide what's not offensive? All right, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Hello. I'm very thankful for the chance to be participating in this discussion. Clearly,
It's a provocative discussion. It raises a lot of questions. And I want to speak to you guys today from a standpoint of what I learned when I was studying at USC, which was empathy. As a theater major, my primary objective was to challenge myself to see if I could put myself in somebody else's shoes and realistically think through and feel through what it might be like to be another person, right? Somebody other than myself. To me, that's where I come from in my interactions. And when I interacted with Sergeant Parker that day, it was, it was basically one of those situations where you've spent your whole life trying to be politically correct, trying to be, to make your family proud, trying to make your community proud. When I was at USC, I worked 2 jobs to get myself through school. I was a student representative at the Office of Admissions, so I was always representing, you know, sort of my place here at USC as a minority student, right? That I have a right to be here, right? You know, I've worked hard. As a resident advisor, which I was a RA all through school so that I could afford to stay in school, it was a lot of that. Let's do programs that help people understand what it's like to be a member of what we call a marginalized group. What does that mean? How can we talk about this in a way that doesn't piss people off? If there's a racial conflict on the dorm floor, how can we address this in a way that makes the people who are concerned about being seen as racist, make them feel okay, right? And how can we also make the students who are feeling marginalized and the students who are feeling oppressed and feeling invisible and feeling like they don't have a voice, how can we make them also a part of the conversation? I come from a very, what you might say, unstable childhood. My parents divorced when I was young. I moved around a lot. I was constantly changing schools. I was constantly trying to see how I could fit myself into the cultural dynamic of the environment that I found myself in, right? And I bring that up because education was very important to my parents, right? My mom is from Jamaica, and she moved here to get a better education. My dad grew up in Watts in the 60s when, there were still separate bathrooms, there was riots. My dad lived in Mississippi in the 60s when you could be killed for being a black and white couple. Just really, someone could be angry and decide that they wanted to, get rid of you, sort of that. And that happened. And we don't talk about that a lot, right? That's something that we like to say, okay, we have a black president, like, these issues of race, don't talk about them. Like, it just makes people uncomfortable, right? And so I grew up, with my mother as a Jamaican immigrant, or not immigrant, but she had a green card. I'm legal, don't worry. But, coming here for education, being the only black girl in all-white private schools, right? And my mom, when I was like 7 years old, she said to me, because I came home crying one day because all of the white girls had been talking in class, and then I was the one that got in trouble, right? And we all have things like this when we're little. Like, it could be anything, right? It's because you have red hair, or because you have a big nose, whatever. But I just happened to be the black girl that got in trouble quite a bit for what I felt like wasn't a fair reason. And I remember my mom explaining to me, and I was like 7, and it just made such an impact on me. She was like, Danielle, I love you, you're awesome, but you have to understand that you have to work twice as hard to not get in trouble, right? You have to work twice as hard to get what the other white girls in your class are going to just get handed to them, because people are threatened by your blackness. You're the only black girl in the class. People are threatened by that. They see criminals on TV. They see prostitutes on TV. You know, they see these images and they go, oh, are we getting one of those people in our school, right? Like on some level, that was the environment that I grew up in. So I worked very hard to do everything I could to present myself in a way that wouldn't threaten people, right? That would just, I'm not going to be the angry black woman here. You know, I'm going to be the person that helps mediate this conflict, that helps bring us together. But when I interacted with Sergeant Parker on September 11th, it had been not the first time, not the second time, not the third time. It had been the fourth time since I had shaved my head that a police officer had been called because there was suspicious activity and gone about questioning my partner Brian and I based on that assumption of suspicious activity. Now, I wrote about this in my LA Times essay, and I only have a minute left, so I won't go too much into it, but one of those times I was we were sorting through his dad's garage in Loma Linda, which is where I was born, and he's also from there. And somebody called the police saying that a suspicious black and white couple was loitering the area and that there may have been a potential robbery. So when so when the police officer arrived, and again, the time in Loma Linda had been the third time, right? So the first two times, I gave my ID. I, tried to be as gracious as possible. I tried to, go along with it. The second time, same thing. Even outside of the police, my mom was having surgery a few months back, and we had to go to the hospital early in the morning, and I had gone out to the courtyard to get some air, and I had fallen asleep, and I woke up with a security guard standing over me saying, ma'am, what's in your cup? So my boyfriend's a raw food chef. I had green juice in my cup, right? But apparently somebody had called the hospital security at the Christian hospital saying that there was a drunk in the courtyard. And the security officer was trying to actively escort me out of the hospital. So I burst into tears. I explained to him, my mom's having surgery. I'm very stressed. Perhaps your first line of inquiry might be to ask if I was okay, right? But again, these are all sort of swimming in my identity, in my emotional body. When I talked to Sergeant Parker that day, also swimming in my emotional body was watching on the news, Ferguson, talking to my dad about all of these things on the news that had been coming up. Black man gets shot when reaching for his ID. These things like, are we, in the 60s? Like, I can't, it was hard for me, all of this has been hard for me to digest, and I've been trying to just like, okay, be gracious, approach this in a way that's civil. But when Sergeant Parker approached me that day, actually he didn't approach me, he approached Brian and asked Brian for my ID. Now, to some people that may not seem like a big deal. For me, having experienced what I just described, for the officer not even to give me the dignity of addressing me and explaining what happened, for him to make the assumption that it was okay to speak to the male there, the white male there, things that I'd like to say, no, we're beyond this, it doesn't matter. But again, all of these things stirring in my emotional body by the time I got to that day, that Thursday, it was upsetting. Now, I was on the phone talking to my dad. As I said in many interviews and to the officer there, we were making out. There was no nudity. We haven't done anything wrong. In that moment, it seemed like none of that mattered, because what mattered was that what you can hear Sergeant Parker say on the police audio, she needs to learn that she doesn't dictate what happens. That dynamic is what I experienced, and as much as I wanted to just make it easier for everyone, at a certain point I think enough is enough and you have to say something. So the anger that you see me expressing, the frustration, the feelings of desperation or of invisibility, it had reached a point where I couldn't repress that any longer. Langston Hughes has a poem, it's one of my favorite poems, it's called Harlem, and it goes, what happens to a dream deferred? Do you guys know that one? So you know, does it dry up like a sugary sweet, da-da-da, he goes through all these things, and the last thing he says, or does it explode, right? So that day, yes, I exploded, right? There was an explosion, but if we're going to condemn me, then we also have to look at the entire society that I am a product of, right? We get to look in these discussions, these beautiful professors and you beautiful people who want to have this discussion, we get to look at why this is the way it is, and we get to examine it and become more aware of it. So I really appreciate you guys joining me in this. And as I said from the beginning, for me, empathy, if we can learn what it might be like to walk in somebody else's shoes. And I will say this, and I know I'm almost done, but you know, people have, on the internet, you know, they get really excited. And so I've been getting quite a lot of interesting comments on my Facebook wall. Everything from, you're a prostitute, get back to walking the streets where you belong, this is why we call you niggers, she should be horsewhipped. Somebody telling Brian he might as well just hang himself, these sorts of things, right? And one of the other things is that you must be a cop hater. You must be a cop hater, right? You know, these race-baiting cop haters, right? I want to acknowledge that I do believe cops have a tough job, right? They have to mediate conflict. They have to deal with people who are upset and try and diffuse situations. And that is why I think these discussions are important, because for those officers who may not have understood why a black woman would be upset in a situation like this, right? That's understandable. Maybe they don't, you know, haven't experienced that. Maybe they didn't grow up like I did, right? For those officers, we can begin to start this dialogue that hopefully we can all like benefit from and we can become more aware. So, you know, I just want to acknowledge the police officers, you know, who your, you know, friends, your families, those who are listening, you know, because I do feel like it is a difficult job, but I do think discussions like this can help us all have greater compassion and understanding and empathy and awareness. So I appreciate you guys having me, and I look forward to the questions, because I think that's where, you know, again, the dialogue happens and we get to get clear about what kind of society we all want to live in.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Thank you to Professor Rich and Professor Williams and to Danielle for your very thought-provoking presentations and comments. I think you've given us a lot to think about, even past this event, and a lot to talk about while we're here. So, Shana, I want to turn to you and give you an opportunity to reflect on some of the things that were put forward for us in these presentations.
I think like most other folks now, I'm most interested in discussion, but I guess I just wanted to reinforce this question of black women's sexuality, not just in public, but in kind of historical practice. And really play off of what Deanna was discussing as this kind of genealogy of caricature, of making black women's sexuality aberrant, grotesque, and criminalized. Very much a part of this history of Black women's engagement, not only in the public sphere, but also in these micro-publics of the plantation, of rural spaces, of the university, okay? That Black women's sexuality has been criminalized and made to be spectacle for other people's enjoyment and disgust as well. And I just wanted to make sure that we were clear that this is very material, right? That we're here discussing someone's experience, someone's life in this moment, but there are other ways in which this truth is made material. In part, in this state, through recent announcement by Governor Jerry Brown, so 2 weeks after the incident happened with Ms. Watts, Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill that bans prisons from sterilizing inmates without their consent. Sterilizing women, inmates, without their consent. In 2014, the state of California has seen it necessary, due to historical and present practice, to ban forced sterilization. That to me is a moment of reckoning with exactly this question of how Black women and how Black and brown women are situated in society, not just those who have been formally charged and convicted of crimes, but those who are always already criminalized as made somehow outside of acceptable sexualities and practices. And so that evidence to me, in combination with a lot of other situations and pieces of evidence, make it very clear that there is something materially and politically different about how Black women's sexuality is witnessed and experienced in this society, and which has caused certain types of responses from Black women, such as respectability politics. If you've heard of respectability politics, it's this practice of performing a certain type of femininity within the public sphere that will actually abate some of these criminalizing practices. It's a performance that Black women enact, a mask that Black women wear to actually keep at bay those accusations of the prostitute, of the Hottentot, of the Jezebel, or even of the mammy, right? As a way to forestall some of those critiques and caricatures. And I want to point out that these respectability politics have already been present in this situation with Ms. Watts, not just the way that it's been covered by the news, but also the demand from the NAACP that she apologize to the LAPD.
Not the NAACP, the
representatives.
They were.
Representatives.
I invited them today, by the way. Is anyone? No. Okay.
They were individuals.
I thought it would be a good opportunity to continue the discussion in a positive way.
But it's a kind gesture. But representatives of the NAACP and other civil rights organizations that spoke out publicly in collusion or in support of the LAPD and called for an apology from Ms. Watts. And so those types of respectability politics are adding insult to injury, right? Not only are Black women facing this history and being made victim to it, but then they're also being held responsible for it and made to make amends in these situations.
Can I just piggyback really quickly off of that? In my comments, I actually included something from, I believe his name is Ofari Hutchinson, where he says, Black men are getting killed over this. Stop being stupid. Like, that's his comment, which is my point about civil rights issues being gendered. That is, if you're not threatened with death, does that mean you're not presenting a valid civil rights issue? I hope we're not at that point.
But it's also not to absent the real threat of death that women face as well.
Sure, sure.
Right. Another question I have, which I believe that really we have begun, more than begun a conversation about today, is why have Black female bodies and sexualities been such publicly contested territories of social and moral regulation? How does this operate in terms of dominant society? And how does this work in terms of intraracial policing of African American communities by the Black middle class or bourgeoisie? And my third train of questioning that I'd like to put forward today is interracial intimacy understood publicly as more dangerous or more offensive than same-race intimacies? I believe we have Professor Williams' answer on that one. What conditions influence such perceptions, and how does this impact perceptions of criminality or social disorder? So we do have a young lady in the, two actually people in the back with microphones. So if people will raise their hands, we'll do our very best to get to everybody's questions and comments. So I'd like to open up the floor at this time. Down here.
So just a simple question to start off. How do you feel the race of your partner played into effect in the officer's interaction with you and also with him? Because I didn't necessarily get the background context of what the officer said to him as well, too.
Well, he's right there. You might want to ask him.
Feel free to answer the question, too.
So, could you be more specific of what you're asking directly to me?
Oh, so just I want to try and get some context because I know that she felt enraged by the questioning, and I didn't necessarily understand what role that you played in the whole situation because we did focus on the black female perspective, but I also wanted to get your perspective on this as well too.
Yes, well, my previous experiences with law enforcement had been very extensive, and I personally, like, because of that, I wanted to engage with him in a more civil way than I would have usually done in the past. And at the same time, because we had had those 3 prior experiences, which were just, in my opinion, not cool. It was within 4 or 5 months after we both shaved our heads. And I had had dreadlocks and long hair and beard and been profiled many times in the past. So my interaction with him was, we had actually made in a previous agreement and arrangement that if something like this had happened, I would just really literally just try to diffuse it, be, you know, as polite and as loving as possible, and so I was just going based on the moment and how it was happening, and when he asked me for her ID, and she said, "Don't give it," I gladly was not going to give it. And then when she walked away after he never told her not to walk away, and then he started talking with me like extensively, I was very cordial and it was making jokes with him, just kind of back and forth. But I was letting him kind of like lead it, and he was saying things that inside in my brain I wasn't really very happy with. I wasn't responding in a way that I might have in the past, because I would have ended up in handcuffs myself as well. But yeah, I mean, I was just, you know, in the moment, just trying to support her, and the fact that we had been through these experiences before didn't feel really good, and I also wanted her out of handcuffs as quick as possible, and I didn't think that she deserved to be in them at the same time.
I will say that that I did notice that the tone of the officer completely changed when he was talking with me versus when he was talking with Brian. And I think, for whatever reason, he felt more comfortable with Brian, so he felt more comfortable to say things that I think kind of show you a little bit about what his approach to it was. Like I said, he says to Brian, she needs to learn, she doesn't dictate what happens. You know, she'll learn. This sort of line of speaking that basically says, I'm going to teach her a lesson, kind of thing. And because he, you know, was not a threatening presence for whatever reason, he didn't bring up race, right? Or he brought it up, but the officer, it was much easier for the officer to not, you know, pay attention to it. So I think if anything, it shows us, it gives us more to talk about because it gives us more to reflect on. If he felt comfortable around him, you know, what does that say about the society we live in? Isn't his job as a police officer to diffuse the situation, to sort of bring order, to maintain peace? I found out recently that they actually, you know, they're peace officers is another term, right? So if their purpose is to maintain order and peace, it seems like he sort of went into something and created disorder when he could have easily maintained order and peace. So
I wasn't there,
yeah.
but
yeah.
I do write about these issues, and one of the terms I use to describe it is phenomenological blackness, that when you are partnered with a black woman, right? Or if you're a white person who's partnered with a black person, encounters many experiences of racism that actually teach them what the world is like for a person of color. And in your comments, I mean, I listened to the tape a couple of times, in your comments, I could see that perspective emerging. Like, I do understand where she's coming from. I'm out here on the outside, and so this officer's talking to me a particular way, but this consciousness is developing. So as you listen to the tape, you can see that consciousness emerging. The other, I think, completely disturbing thing about the officer's comments is he occasionally invites you to engage in these sort of racially charged stereotypes about her sexuality. She keeps you busy, doesn't she? She's a handful, isn't she? Right? Goading you into saying something that would be inappropriate that really is about whatever is happening in his imagination.
I'm sorry, I have just a very quick question. Brett Sheehan, Department of History. And I don't know your last name, so I'll call you Brian, if that's okay. Did he ask you for your ID?
He did ask me for my ID, and like I said to the gentleman over there, I really am happy to give an officer my ID in this day and age. Because before all this, I literally would give it up because I thought that I had to. That I didn't even know that I didn't have to, and I'd feel afraid before I would even encounter with an officer, and I'd feel like I have to get my ID up. So, and because of, I have had some, like I said, some encounters in the past with what I don't consider even illegal, marijuana, something that I feel to this day is something that I believe in, that everyone has the right to use or not. And I just wanted to give him it because I could, because I didn't have anything to worry about, because I haven't done anything illegal in years, and I was just happy to. And that was basically it.
What I have to say is more of a comment, more so than a question. I just wanted to commend you for what you did, because I feel like as a black woman myself and going through a lot of predominantly white schooling, that I feel like I have to self-monitor myself and always have to be, oh, I don't want to be the angry black woman, I don't want to have to get upset. And the fact that it's frustrating in a way because either you lose or you lose. Both times you lose, because either you speak up and then you get penalized as just being an angry black woman, or if you don't say anything, it's still you're being shaped by perceptions of what other people think of you. So I commend what you did and what you had to say. Even though other people might not agree with you, I agree with you. And it's something that's been coming up more so in conversations with other minorities, especially black women, that feel that they are stifled and controlled and have to be shaped into a certain kind of way, whether or not they want to speak out. And all of a sudden, if I say anything, I'm being an angry black woman. That's not true. I'm just angry. But then if anyone else would do the same thing, they're not being shaped in that certain kind of way. So I feel like that's an important topic that you talked about and that you expressed in this situation. I think it's a very pivotal topic, but I just want to say that.
Thank you for that reflection. There's been a hand down here.
I'm really, is this on? I can never tell when I'm talking to you. I'm really fascinated by, and it's up on the slides right now, is the significance of your hair being shaved, and his as well. I actually, this is a half comment, half question. I had a very short pixie cut, borderline buzz cut for about 1.5 years. And the only really effect of it I ever experienced was from mostly white men just specifically saying, or showing that I was not as attractive with this haircut. I never got anything from law enforcement or anything like that. It was never sort of an element of it. And so I'm really interested in sort of what you view to have been the added element of it. I think I went to an all-girls prep school, and I'm interested also by your comments about having to really try to not be the angry black woman, and what you said as well, how you have to try doubly hard to be not threatening, not scary, really nice, smiling all the time, and definitely not having short hair, which is basically seen as this universal sign of, I am a feminist, I don't care what men think, blah, blah, I want to burn bras, which is so interesting how that is just what that means. But so I just sort of want to hear more about that. Yeah. I find that fascinating.
Well, I'll give you just a little context. So clearly I wanted to move to LA because I wanted to be an actress, and I'm very aware that you get roles based on like what people's opinion is of like what black women are and what they can be and do. And so when I first started out, I wasn't getting a lot of roles. I felt like my acting was really good. I couldn't quite figure it out. I flat out had an African-American casting director tell me, she said, honey, go get yourself a weave and come back to my office, and I bet you'll book work. And within, I got the weave. That next 4 months, I booked 4 jobs. And that's after like a couple years of struggling. Why am I not booking work? You know, I graduated from USC. I was doing everything right. I got the weave, and then I booked 4 jobs, right? So, I mean, it was just like a very obvious kind of correlation, right? I'll take it back to we all grew up, somebody around us played with Barbie dolls, right? Most Barbie dolls don't have hair like this, right? We grow up with these ideas of, like what you were saying, what makes, the word you used, it was so good, politics, respectability politics. So this idea of what makes me valuable, right? Am I valuable to society because I'm attractive to men, right? And I think a lot of women kind of relate to that. You're popular in high school, or you're not because you're attractive to men. Or so these ideas of what makes you attractive to men goes all the way back to, you know, so many like conditionings that we've had. Our Barbie dolls all have long hair, and you can play with it, and you know it does something to the attractability of, I think, of. So when I did decide to shave my hair, it was it was like basically I was like, well, my acting career might be over. You know, I mean, really that was what it came down to. I was like, I may not book parts. You know what? And when I met Brian, we actually moved to Venice. I was basically living at a meditation center, like running this community garden, turned off my phone. I mean, I was done, you know, I was done. And when I finally decided to shave my hair, it was gonna be either I'm valuable in this society as a intelligent, passionate, creative person, or I'm trying to make myself digestible based on how I look, and, you know, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I did that for a very long time. I even had this expression, I'd rather get a weave than a day job. I mean, meanwhile my friends were like, you know, working their waitressing jobs. I was like, I'm gonna get my weave and I'm gonna become an actress, you know, so I get it. But it just had reached a point where I wasn't willing to participate in that way anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. It's equally disturbing that then it has sort of criminal justice implications. It wasn't just a sort of shift in choice in terms of your career. It's that this private choice that you made, right, about your professional life, this private choice you made suddenly had all these secondary effects in terms of being stopped by police and having increased surveillance and having her relationship questioned. And I think that's what is additionally disturbing at a different level.
And if I could add to that, I wonder if and I'm just thinking out loud here, but I wonder if from a distance, since long hair signifies femininity, if from a distance the relationship might look like 2 men to some, and whether or not, I mean, the queer point on which I ended, the fact that lewd conduct charges have historically not been about, you know, arresting and charging and handcuffing heterosexual teenagers in the back seats of cars, but rather same-sex relationships. I wonder if that's, you know, another aspect of this. So this is both about race, but very much, and people haven't talked about that so much, about sexuality and gender as well.
I think this brings some very interesting things together, and I just want to build a little bit on what both of you have said. So we've got this question of what constitutes femininity and desirability regarding women, and particularly regarding Black women. So long hair, tractable, submissive, right? These are some of the desirable traits in women. And then what happens when these socially prescribed desirable traits are not met, at what point does this come to be seen as, does this Black femininity or femininity come to be seen as disorderly, dangerous, grotesque, unfeminine, and therefore not worthy of treatment, right, the idea that you treat a lady a certain way, right? But you don't have to treat women who aren't ladies, right, in another way. That's part of what's happening here and part of the conversation.
I will say, you know, as far as like the criminal implications, and this is something that a lot of people may not know, but when I first wrote this statement on my Facebook, and I did an interview with BuzzFeed, and they contacted the LAPD for a comment. The LAPD had no record of the incident. No record of the incident. It wasn't until the story started to pick up that we did an interview with CNN that then the LAPD had record of the, so they created, it seems like, I don't know what they do there, but exactly. But it seems like they created a record of the incident to respond to the backlash that they were receiving, right? And in that record, they said that the officer conducted an investigation and he decided that no crime was committed. Then Brian and I listened to this somebody on Facebook with a Confederate flag as their Facebook profile picture posted this radio talk show that Sergeant Parker had gone on called the John and Ken Show, I believe it was, where the officer is talking to the radio show host, describing how I was lying about any that race was involved with this at all. And he says that he only contacted the witnesses after there was a backlash, like after there was a press, issue, right? That's when he contacted the witnesses to find out what their statement was. And then the radio show goes on, the radio show hosts go on to say that I'm crying fake tears, that I'm crazy, that I probably need mental help, right? Why would anybody react that way unless she's trying to cover up the fact that she was obviously having sex in the car, right? That's the assumption that they made, right? They go on to play the audio that the police officer gave them, right, to make fun of me with. And then, and basically, won't stop until I'm discredited. A caller calls in and says, well, actually, they raised some interesting points when she walks away. The officer didn't tell her to stop, and then he sends 2 backup officers to put her into handcuffs. They cut her wrist. Was all that force really necessary? The radio show hosts, they say, okay, well, thank you, and they abruptly hang up the call, right? And then a month and a half later, Brian and I are served with criminal charges, when initially there was no record of the incident until I went to my Facebook and said, I have to express this somehow. This doesn't feel right. I don't know what the answer is, but maybe the general public has some thoughts about this. Like maybe we care that America actually says we represent freedom and equality to the world, right? That's our whole thing. We go out into the world and we say, we represent freedom and equality. But then here on our soil, there's an issue of equality. I actually told the police officer very passionately, because I was upset that I was still in handcuffs after he had told me that I wasn't a threat, that there was nothing on my record to keep me there. I said to him, I said, officer, we are all equal. And he asked me if I needed paramedics. As though me saying passionately, look, we're all equal. Can you acknowledge that I'm equal? I said, can you acknowledge that I'm upset because I feel like you're acting as though you have more power than me. He said, I do have more power than you. Finally, at desperation, and you can see I'm crying, I say, you guys took an oath to protect and serve all of the people of this country. They take an oath that says they will protect the Constitution for all citizens. I said, you work for me, right? I'm exasperated at this point. He says, I don't work for you.
And really, you should go back and listen to the audio tape in its entirety, because all of this is there. You have 2 minutes and 30 seconds that TMZ excerpted to sort of make a point. But it's a much, much longer interaction. So you should really listen to the tape instead of us discussing all what you say here.
Well, but I do bring those things up because the media is here, and I'm so thankful because this is this discussion that has gone, to the masses. I'm getting emails from people in Nigeria, from people in Cambodia, from people in South Africa who are in interracial relationships saying, oh my God, I thought America was beyond this. I can't believe this, what is going on? And me going, well, I can't control what the media says. I can't control how they cover this. I can't control that it makes it look like I'm this hysterical person because the officer released an edited audio that contributes, like you said, to an incomplete picture of the situation.
And I do want to emphasize, it's really important in listening to the video to recognize that when Danielle says to the officer, do you know how many times we've been stopped just because I'm black? Do you know how many times we've been stopped because we're an interracial couple? She's not calling him a racist. No. She's asking him to recognize that the Terry stop he is involved in is responding perhaps to someone else's racial stereotypes, and to recognize her humanity in that circumstance and just acknowledge what is happening. He may have had to do precisely what he did. He may have been legally obligated to again ask the questions that he asked. But what you were asking for was an acknowledgement, and he met that like you were calling him a racist, like you were playing the race card, and it escalated everything in that interaction from that point on. And I think that's the classic post-racial move, is that in the colorblindness era, we felt sorry for people who raised racism and, oh, we pitied them and they don't really understand. In the post-racial era, people get angry. They get angry and they actually retaliate against you.
What post-racial era?
Well, I say it with some irony, but right, most people describe it that
irony.
way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, we have a mixed-race president right now. But for everybody, for most people, he's the first black president, right? So we're sort of dismissing a whole half of our heritage. I mean, it didn't just, black people and white people created, I mean, a lot of people of all colors created this country, but slavery was an institution where black people and white people were working hand in hand, and yes, there was oppression, and yes, there was lots of things that are uncomfortable to talk about. But I think it would be short-sighted to sort of dismiss that we're all co-creating this, right?
Well, and if I could pick up on that, because I know that my comments were focused on the sort of deep historical background of how we decide as a society, as a culture, what is lewd. But what has really gotten me interested in this story, I mean, has been what happened subsequently, has been the escalation, and has been the concern to prevent another Ferguson on the part of the police officer, perhaps. And then the self-appointed sort of civil rights activists, some of whom are themselves former LAPD officers, retired, throwing in this sort of respectability politics and using the term crying wolf to say that that Danielle was lying. And for me, having shown you those rooftop sex photos, I'm less concerned with what she and her boyfriend might or might not have been doing, but with the broader question, particularly in the aftermath of the whole hashtag campaign after Ferguson, after the whole question of, is it relevant that Michael Brown was no angel, right? Is it relevant whether or not they were fornicating or, however, being involved in lewd and dissolute conduct? Is the punishment for that handcuffing? And to what extent would acquiring the ID have resolved the question? At what point does it stop becoming about the investigation and start becoming about retaliating against a law enforcement officer retaliating against a member of We the People for articulating what she believed her rights and therefore the law to be, right? And so that's how do we decide, who gets to say what the law is?
And I will say this, the officer, Sergeant Parker, is still under investigation for the way he handled the detainment.
Is it for that or for turning over the
No,
audio?
we spoke with the investigating officer. It's for both.
Okay.
Although you wouldn't know it because the way that the media has covered it, it's that the only thing he's under investigation for right now is for turning over the audio. But we spoke with the investigating officer, and he said, no, your concerns that you presented about being handcuffed, your wrist being cut, these things, walking away and not being told that you're being detained, and then being forced into handcuffs later, those things are all still being investigated. So I just...
think the key statement is, I'm going to get your ID one way or another. That's sort of a really disturbing moment.
And also, that's what I think that reminded me of something, because even after he got my ID, even after he says, no, you're not a threat, it's the people who called, we just had to handle the call, even after he says that he checked my ID, there's nothing on my record to keep me there, which he says in a way, oh, not wanted for murder, or, in a way that's like...
Or outstanding parking tickets.
Right, so even after all of that, I ask to see my phone. He says, no, you can see it in a second, forces me to stay in handcuffs, and forces me to stay there. And, I don't know if any of you guys have been, put in handcuffs, but, I wasn't actually working at that studio that day, but I had just come from meeting the director of the CBS Diversity Showcase. One of my friends is actually a writer. She's the head writer of the CBS Diversity Showcase. And, it's an area where, your presentation, the way people see you, matters. So not only has he told me that I haven't done anything wrong, that I'm basically free to go, but I have to stay in handcuffs on the side of the road just because he decides that he has more power than me, and when an officer tells you to do something, you have to do it. That's the law. That's exactly what he said to me. Now, I know you guys are law students here, and I know that you're aware that that's not the law, right? When an officer tells you to do something, yes, you want to be kind and respectful, but it's not actually the law that you have to do it, especially in a situation where,
I think some of the backlash you received is because people are afraid. So they're afraid for the working class young man, young woman who encounters a police officer, and the police officer gives a command, and that person tries to engage in some sort of civil protest and doesn't comply. And that is a dangerous and fraught situation. So you shouldn't sort of handle that encounter in a light way. There are dangers associated with that kind of resistance. But as a matter of principle, as a conceptual matter, as a legal matter, right, there was a lot of space in that interaction where the officer engaged in some really questionable conduct that didn't seem about the investigation itself.
We only have a few minutes left, so I want to turn it back to the audience. We have someone back there with a question.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you for everybody on the panel. This has been really enriching. I have a comment that's kind of a question and then another question. I found it interesting that the NAACP comments on this in hopes of mitigating or repressing a potential Ferguson, especially in the moment. I don't know if they're okay, it's mostly the officer then. Okay, but maybe how can we read this as trying to be part of repressing a potential Ferguson in the same moment when people who are part of NAACP and other sort of old classic civil rights organizations are not being welcomed into Ferguson itself in terms of some of the activists. And the other question comes from the international perspective, which I find fascinating, about America branding itself to the rest of the sexually repressed world, that we are free and equal here. This reminds me of the comment that Bill Maher had on Friday about, oh, but how free are people in the Middle East and women and homosexuals? Is there a gay bar in Gaza? As if that was the marker for freedom in the Middle East. And so I found it interesting that they kind of push this narrative about what it means to be a democratic state, but we are kind of very blurry in terms of the lines, as you all mentioned, in terms of what is lewd or sexual expression. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I would say my take on the black leadership that has denounced Ms. Watts and demanded that she apologize to the Los Angeles Police Department for quote-unquote crying wolf is not actually about trying to mitigate a potentially Ferguson-like situation, but is actually more about them trying to distance what they have posed as the respectable civil rights movement from disreputable people who could damage the force and the image of the movement itself. It's classic, like Rosa Parks. She wasn't the first woman who wouldn't get up from the bus. The person before her was a pregnant teenage girl, and they said, "Oh no, you're not a good test case." So I think it's not actually about diffusing those kinds of racial tensions.
It's also about them needing then to deal with, to really wrestle with these messy conjunctures of race and gender and sexuality, all of these intersections that historically these formal organizations have been very ill-equipped to manage.
This is where, yeah. This has been an extremely emotionally charged discussion, but I kind of wonder whether it's too calm. Because there are, sorry. So these are really deeply embedded issues in our society, and given, I mean, it's been noted that there's this post-racial era where it's easy to pretend that there are no problems. And so I wonder whether panels like this, where we just calmly talk about the issues, are just too easy to ignore, that they don't get anything done, that we need to have Fergusons everywhere.
Well, I along those lines of empathy, right? If this makes you feel something deep, I encourage you to take that deep feeling and take that out to the people that you encounter and the people that will listen to you because you are a white man, and they won't get upset with you, and they won't try and like dismiss and degrade and sort of, you know, decharacter what you have to say, right? Because you're feeling it in a way that's a little bit more objective. You know, sometimes emotion is harder for people to swallow. Sometimes, you know, like I said, I can't tell you how many hundreds of people have commented on my Facebook wall saying, your career's over, we'll never watch anything else you do, because I showed anger about something that was a recurring pattern of experience, that, you know, a recurring thing, you know, that I'm aware of because of my education, right? Because of being an undergraduate and going to panels like this and having these discussions. And so I encourage you to take that emotion that you feel and you know, to take that to your peers and to let them feel that, so that we can have real discussions, you know, that aren't sort of stepping on eggshells, trying not to offend people.
And also, just as a nod towards Black women's history, I would encourage you to look up the theory of dissemblance and see if that might answer your question as well.
Unfortunately, we are actually out of time. It seems like there are many people who want to continue to have the conversations. I encourage you guys to continue these conversations in the hallway with each other. I'd like to thank again the Gould School of Law for sponsoring this event and our panelists.